Hey guys, tonight we begin with something far more terrifying than any plague, war or medieval dungeon. The strict, suffocating, lipstick-coated rulebook of the 1960s American sorority girl. We're talking white gloves and weigh-ins, curfews enforced by a woman with the hearing of a bat and the mercy of a tax collector, and more unwritten rules than there are pages in the phone book you weren't allowed to use after 10. Forget the glossy yearbook photos and the matching cardigans. Behind every bright smile was a world of relentless surveillance, baffling etiquette, and the constant low-grade dread of being spotted climbing out of a boy's car 1 minute past curfew. Before we slip into our saddle shoes, a heartfelt thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic. Your ideas genuinely shape what gets made here, and this little channel only grows because of thoughtful suggestions like yours. So, if you're enjoying these late-night journeys, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Somehow it's always 2 a.m. somewhere, and if you'd rather drift off with just your ears, the channel is now on Spotify as well, so the link's down in the description if you'd like to wander over. Now, dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, and get comfortable, ideally with both feet flat on the floor, because somewhere a house mother is always watching. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to live by a list of rules longer than the Constitution? Could you survive being weighed in front of the very women who claim to be your sisters? Could you keep a smile pinned to your face through posture class, white glove inspection, and a dinner where reaching for the wrong fork was practically a federal offence? Would you remember the secret handshake, the secret song, and the 17 separate rules about exactly how to wear one tiny pin over your heart? And could you make it home before curfew with your reputation, your grade point average, and your dignity all somehow still intact? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up in the autumn of 1963. Your hair is in curlers, your roommate is already crying about a boy, and a bell is about to ring that will decide the entire shape of your day. Welcome to the sisterhood. Try very hard not to get campused. You wake before dawn to a bell, because of course you do. Not a gentle chime, not a clock radio you can swat into silence, but a real, insistent, building-wide bell that means precisely what it always means. Get up, get pretty, and get downstairs before anyone notices you didn't. You're sharing a room with 2, maybe 3 other girls in a grand old house that smells of hairspray, floor wax, and somebody's contraband cigarette. Your bed sits on a sleeping porch where the windows stay open year-round because a long-dead house rule decided that fresh air builds character. You're cold, you're exhausted, and you're already behind. They told you this would be the best years of your life. They did not mention the bell. Let's talk about the sleeping arrangements, because they are something else entirely. In a great many houses, the bedrooms weren't really for sleeping at all. They were for getting dressed, for storing your things, for crying about a boy in relative privacy. The actual sleeping happened in a cold dormitory or a screened porch lined with bunks, where the entire pledge class breathed the same frigid night air in unison, like a barracks full of debutantes. The theory was that sleeping in the cold was healthy, invigorating, good for the complexion. The reality was a row of young women burrowing under wool blankets, wearing socks to bed in the dead of winter and waking up able to see their own breath. It's like camping, except you paid dues for the privilege and there was a curfew. Privacy, meanwhile, was a quaint idea that lived somewhere far away, probably in a single occupancy apartment you could only dream about. You changed in front of your roommates. You studied in front of your roommates. You conducted your entire emotional life in front of your roommates. Someone was always awake. Someone was always listening. The girl in the next bunk knew your business before you'd finished living it, and by breakfast it would belong to the whole floor. There was a strange comfort in it, the constant closeness, the sense of never being alone. There was also the slow, grinding reality of never, ever actually being alone. And the mornings moved fast. From the moment that bell clanged, you were on a schedule that ran like a small perfumed army. There were minutes, not hours, to transform yourself from a shivering girl in curlers into a presentable young lady fit to be seen at the breakfast table. Beds had to be made, hair had to be dealt with, faces had to be assembled. The pledges often had it worst, expected to be up first, ready first, and helpful to everyone else. You learned to move with purpose, to dress while half asleep, to do your eyebrows in a mirror 3 girls deep. Efficiency wasn't a virtue here, it was survival. But underneath all of it, threaded through the cold air and the crowded bunks and the relentless bell, there really was something that felt like belonging. You were part of something now, something with a name and a history, and a house full of girls who, for better and for worse, were yours. That was the trade the whole system offered. Surrender your privacy, your sleep, and a healthy chunk of your freedom, and in exchange you'd never feel quite so alone again. It was a beautiful promise, and like most beautiful promises, it came with a great deal of very fine print. Welcome to morning in the sisterhood. The bell, by the way, is going to ring again tomorrow. Let's talk about the most powerful woman you will ever fear, the house mother. She exists somewhere between a beloved grandmother and a federal corrections officer, and she runs this house with a velvet glove wrapped tightly around an iron clipboard. She knows what time you came in. She knows whose car you climbed out of. She knows you said you were at the library, and she knows full well the library closed 2 hours ago. Nothing slips past her. Not a scuffed heel, not a missing girdle, not the faint trace of a boy's cologne clinging to your collar. She has survived 2 world wars and 1 rationing program, and she will absolutely confine you to the house for a week over a single chipped nail. In time, you will learn to love her. Mostly, though, you will learn to fear her. Understand first what the house mother actually was. In an age when colleges acted in place of your parents, the house mother was the parent, a salaried live-in chaperone, usually an older widow, tasked with safeguarding the morals, manners and reputations of several dozen young women at once. She had her own small apartment near the front door, strategically placed so that nothing entered or left without passing under her gaze. She presided over meals, enforced the rules, and held a near-total authority over your daily life. Think of her as a hotel manager, a den mother, and a parole officer fused into one formidable woman in a tasteful brooch. Her real power, though, lived in the rituals of coming and going. You signed out when you left. You signed in when you returned. You stated where you were going and with whom, and she remembered, because remembering was her job. Stroll in late and she'd be waiting, often in her robe, often with an expression that could curdle milk at 20 paces. There was no sneaking past her. Girls who tried learned quickly that the woman had the situational awareness of a hunting owl and the patience of a glacier. You could lie to your professors, your parents, even yourself. You did not lie to the house mother because she already knew, and yet she was not simply a jailer. She was, for many homesick young women far from their families, a genuine source of comfort. She remembered your birthday. She noticed when you were sad. She fussed over you when you were sick and quietly took the side of any girl who'd been wronged. She enforced the rules, yes, but she also softened them when it mattered, looked the other way at exactly the right moment, and offered the kind of steady, unglamorous care that a frightened freshman didn't know she needed. The fear and the affection grew side by side, tangled together until you couldn't quite separate them. It was, on reflection, a strange role to ask of one woman, to be loved and feared in equal measure, to mother dozens of girls who weren't hers and discipline them all the same. She held enormous sway over your social life, your privileges, your good standing in the house, and she rarely had to raise her voice to do it. A lifted eyebrow from the right house mother could end a romance, cancel a weekend, and reduce a confident young woman to apologetic mush in roughly 4 seconds. So you behaved. You smiled, you signed the ledger honestly, and you kept both feet, as the saying went, very firmly on the floor. Because in this house, presidents came and went, sisters graduated and scattered, traditions bent and shifted with the years. But the house mother was forever, and the house mother was watching, always watching. Now it's time to get dressed. And no, you don't simply throw on whatever's clean. There is a code, and the code is law. Skirts must fall a respectable distance below the knee, blouses must be pressed, and slacks are forbidden in the dining room, the parlour, and roughly anywhere a human being might actually want to wear them. You will be girdled, stockinged, and buttoned into an outfit appropriate for being seen, because being seen is a constant, unavoidable feature of your life. Bermuda shorts might be allowed on the back lawn, but heaven help you if you cross the front threshold in them. You're not getting dressed for yourself or even for the weather. You're getting dressed for the invisible committee that is always, somehow, taking notes. Let's start from the foundation, literally. Before any dress went on, there was the architecture beneath it. The girdle, the stockings, the structured undergarments that turned a young woman into a smooth, controlled silhouette. Comfort was not the point. The point was the line, the shape, the proper appearance of a proper lady, and achieving it meant strapping yourself into engineering that would make a suspension bridge blush. You wriggled, you fastened, you adjusted, and then you spent the entire day quietly aware of every single one of those fastenings. It was like wearing scaffolding to class. Elegant, structural scaffolding, but scaffolding all the same. Then came the rules about what could be worn where, and these were specific to the point of absurdity. Skirts and dresses for the dining hall and the front of the house. Stockings for anything resembling a public appearance. Slacks confined to your room or the back lawn if they were permitted at all. And the great campus paradox of the era. In many places, women weren't allowed to wear pants or shorts to class, even in brutal cold or sticky heat, which produced one of history's stranger sights. Girls would pull a long raincoat over their forbidden shorts, dash across campus through the snow, and shed the coat the moment they arrived, like tiny rebellious magicians. A whole generation learned to smuggle their own legs. Accessories weren't optional extras. They were part of the uniform of respectability. Gloves for the right occasions, a hat for church and for travel, a coordinated handbag, sensible heels, and a string of pearls that may as well have been issued at the door. The goal was to look pulled together at all times, as though you might at any moment be photographed for the yearbook, the society page, or the disapproving memory of an alumna. You did not leave the house looking like you just rolled out of bed, because you had, in fact, just rolled out of bed, and concealing that fact was the entire job, and the consequences of getting it wrong were real. Show up improperly dressed, and you'd hear about it, from the house mother, from the older sisters, from the standards board if it became a pattern. The wrong outfit wasn't just a fashion miss, it was a small failure of character, a sign you didn't take the house, or yourself, seriously enough. Conformity was the look, and the look was the point. A house full of young women, each one polished into the same crisp, coordinated image, was the institution working exactly as designed. So you stood in front of the mirror, girdled and stockinged and gloved, checking the length of your skirt one final time. Somewhere out there the invisible committee was sharpening its pencils. You smoothed your collar, picked up your sensible handbag, and stepped out to face a world that would judge you, head to toe, before you'd said a single word. At least the raincoat had pockets. "Let's head to the bathroom," a phrase that fills every pledge with quiet despair. Picture one long row of sinks, a handful of mirrors, and roughly 20 young women all attempting to transform themselves into magazine covers at the exact same moment. There is steam. There is the hiss of competing hairsprays. There is a war being fought over a single working curling iron. Hot rollers cool on every available surface like little landmines. Someone is crying. Someone is plucking. Someone is loudly narrating her date from last night, while 3 others pretend not to listen and absorb every word. You have approximately 4 minutes to make yourself presentable to a world that will judge you instantly. It's like flossing in a phone booth during an earthquake, and the bell is still ringing. Let's talk about the sheer logistics of it, because they bordered on the impossible. A house full of women, a strictly limited number of sinks, showers and outlets, and a morning schedule that left no room for error. The whole operation ran on an unspoken, ruthlessly enforced timetable. Linger too long at a mirror and you'd feel the heat of a dozen glares on the back of your neck. Hog the shower and your name would be mud by lunch. You learn to be fast, to be efficient, to claim your 2 square feet of counter and defend it like a homesteader. Personal space, in the bathroom, was measured in inches and held by force of will alone. And then there was the hair, which in this era was less a hairstyle and more a public works project. The fashionable looks demanded volume, height, and a smoothness that did not occur in nature, which meant rollers, setting lotion, teasing combs, and enough hairspray to punch a small hole in the atmosphere. Girls slept in their rollers, suffering through the night on a head full of plastic and bristle, then unwound the whole apparatus in the morning and prayed. The air in that bathroom hung thick with aerosol, a chemical fog you could practically chew. If a single match had been struck, the entire pledge class would have achieved liftoff. The mirrors were the true battleground. There were never enough of them, and everyone needed one at the same moment, leaning in for eyeliner, pulling back for the full effect, jostling for the good light by the window. You did your face at an angle, over someone's shoulder, in the narrow slice of reflection nobody else had claimed yet. It was an exercise in spatial cooperation that would have impressed a team of engineers. 20 women applying 20 faces in a space built comfortably for maybe 4. Somehow, every morning it got done. What made it bearable, oddly, was the company. For all the chaos and the elbowing and the competition for the curling iron, that crowded bathroom was where a lot of the real bonding happened. You traded gossip and lipstick in the same breath. You watched each other's dates dissected in real time, offered honest opinions on a questionable hemline, lent a bobby pin to a near stranger who became a friend by the end of the week. The intimacy was total, unavoidable, and occasionally wonderful. There are no secrets between women who have watched each other set their hair at 6 a.m. So you carved out your inch of counter, did your face in a borrowed sliver of mirror, and got out before the next wave crashed in. You emerged into the hallway transformed, polished, presentable, smelling faintly of 3 different hairsprays that were not your own. Behind you, the battle raged on, sink to sink, roller to roller. Ahead of you, the day. And remarkably, against every law of physics and scheduling, you were almost on time. Let's talk about your face, which it turns out was never entirely your own. A proper sorority girl did not simply roll out of bed and exist. She appeared, fully assembled, as though she'd been gently lowered into the day by a team of stylists. Lipstick before breakfast, hair set, sprayed, and architecturally stable. Eyebrows under control, complexion powdered into submission. Being caught bare-faced in the common areas was a small social catastrophe, like answering the door in a towel. The goal was to look effortlessly perfect, a phrase that contains a lie so enormous it could power a small city. There was nothing effortless about it. It took an hour, a dozen products, and the steady nerves of a bomb technician. But you smiled, because the smile was part of the uniform too. Consider the expectation itself, which was relentless. You were to be presentable at all times in all places to all observers. That meant lipstick to walk to class, to fetch the mail, to answer the telephone when no one could even see you. It meant a face that was always company ready, because company could arrive at any moment in the form of a boy, an alumna, a house mother, or simply a sister whose opinion you couldn't afford to ignore. The idea of a day off, of a bare and uncomplicated face, was nearly unthinkable. You were on display from the moment that bell rang until the moment the lights went out, and even then some girls slept in their rollers to get a head start on tomorrow. The cruelest part was the ideal of the natural look, that great con of mid-century beauty. The fashionable face was supposed to appear fresh, wholesome, and unadorned, as if you'd been born radiant and stayed that way. Achieving this required foundation, powder, blush, liner, mascara, brow pencil, and lipstick, layered with the precision of a Renaissance painter and the goal of looking like you'd done nothing at all. You worked for an hour to appear as though you'd work not a single second. It's the kind of paradox that makes you want to lie down, except you couldn't, because you'd just done your hair. There was real maintenance involved too, because a face like that did not survive a day unattended. You carried a compact, a tube of lipstick, the small arsenal of touch-ups required to keep the whole production from sliding off your face by afternoon. You reapplied after meals. You checked yourself in every reflective surface you passed, the window, the spoon, the mirror in your handbag. Vigilance was constant. A young woman of this era developed a sixth sense for the state of her own lipstick that bordered on the supernatural, and underneath all of it ran a quiet, exhausting message that your unadorned self was somehow not quite enough, that the real you needed a coat of polish before she was fit to be seen. The rules rarely said it out loud, but they didn't have to. The expectation did the talking. A girl learned, early and thoroughly, that appearance was currency, that a perfect face opened doors and a careless one invited comment, so she painted it on every single morning and called it routine. So you assembled your face, layer by careful layer, until the girl in the mirror looked fresh, wholesome, and entirely effortless. You tucked your compact into your handbag for the inevitable repairs. You practiced the smile one more time, because the smile, remember, was mandatory. Then you stepped out to meet the day looking exactly like a young woman who hadn't tried at all. It had only taken an hour, a dozen products, and most of your patience. Effortless, they called it. You knew better. Now for one of the era's quietest cruelties, the weigh-in. In more than a few houses, your body was treated as house property, something to be monitored, measured, and openly discussed. Charts were kept, comments were made. A young woman could be pulled aside, scrutinized, and made to feel that her worth had somehow slipped along with the needle on a scale. It was dressed up as concern, as standards, as helping you put your best foot forward, but underneath all the polite language was something colder, the idea that a girl's value could be reduced to her silhouette in a sweater. We laugh at a lot of these rules, and we will laugh at plenty more. This one we'll just sit with for a moment, because behind the white gloves the pressure on these women was very real. Let's be honest about what this actually was. In an era obsessed with a narrow, specific feminine ideal, some houses extended their surveillance from your curfew and your wardrobe straight to your body itself. The reasoning where any was offered leaned on the language of the day, maintaining the image of the house, helping girls look their best, encouraging discipline. But strip away the soft phrasing and what remained was a system that told young women, plainly and repeatedly, that how they looked was a matter of collective concern, and that falling short of an arbitrary standard was a kind of failure. The pressure didn't come from any single rule so much as from everywhere at once. It came from the magazines stacked in the parlour, all featuring the same impossible figure. It came from the offhand comments, the comparisons, the way a certain kind of beauty was rewarded with attention, and a certain kind of body was quietly treated as a problem to be solved. For a young woman already navigating curfews, dress codes, and the relentless hunt for approval, this was simply one more front in a war she never agreed to fight. And it was a war waged largely in whispers, which made it harder to name and harder to escape. What makes it land so heavily looking back is how it was framed as kindness. Nobody called it cruelty. They called it standards, or self-improvement, or simply looking after one another. The sisterhood that offered genuine warmth and belonging could, in the same breath, hand a young woman a lifetime of difficult feelings about her own reflection. Both things were true at once, and that contradiction sat at the centre of the whole experience. The people applying the pressure often believed they were helping. That belief didn't make the pressure weigh any less. We're going to keep this one gentle, because it deserves to be. There's no clever punchline waiting at the end, no absurd comparison that makes it all funny. What there is, instead, is a generation of bright, capable young women, many of whom carried the weight of these expectations long after they'd left the house behind. They learned to measure themselves against a yardstick someone else had chosen, and unlearning that took some of them years. That's not a joke, that's just history, told honestly. So here's the thing worth remembering as you drift off tonight. The young women living inside these rules were not silly or vain for caring. They were responding sensibly enough to a world that told them their appearance was their value. They deserved better than that, and many of them knew it even then. If there's a small mercy in looking back, it's the simple relief of distance, the knowledge that this particular standard at least has loosened its grip. Tonight, you get to exist in your own body without a chart, a comment or a needle on a scale deciding your worth. That's a quiet kind of freedom. Hold on to it. Let's talk about how you carry yourself, because slouching, my dear, is for the weak and the unaffiliated. Many houses ran their pledges through honest-to-goodness charm and poise instruction. How to sit without collapsing, how to cross your ankles rather than your knees, how to walk into a room as though you owned it, and also apologized for owning it. There were books balanced on heads. There were lessons in descending a staircase as if a photographer might leap out at any moment, which, frankly, one might. You learned to stand like a debutante and shake hands like a diplomat. It was equal parts finishing school and military boot camp, only with better lighting and the constant threat of being told you looked tired. Let's begin with the great enemy of the era, the slouch. Good posture wasn't merely encouraged, it was practically a moral position. A young lady held her shoulders back, her chin level, her spine straight as a curtain rod, regardless of how exhausted she was or how heavy her stack of textbooks. To slump was to signal laziness, low breeding, a failure of self-discipline. So you walked the halls like a girl with a yardstick taped to her back, and the famous training exercise made it literal, a book balanced on the crown of your head, daring you to let it slide. Drop it, and you started over. Hold it, and you'd absorbed the lesson, which was that your own comfort came a distant second to the line of your silhouette. Then there was the matter of sitting, which sounds like the easiest thing in the world and absolutely was not. A lady did not flop into a chair. She lowered herself with control. She did not cross her knees like a man in a smoking room. She crossed her ankles, tucked them slightly to one side, and kept her hands folded in her lap. Skirts were smoothed, postures held, the whole arrangement composed as if for a portrait. It required core strength, patience, and a high tolerance for discomfort. You could be perched on the edge of a sofa, smiling pleasantly, while every muscle quietly screamed for permission to relax. Permission did not come. The lessons went on surprisingly thorough. How to enter a room, shoulders square, expression bright, moving with purpose. How to descend a staircase, one hand light on the rail, eyes up rather than on your feet, gliding rather than clumping. How to shake hands, how to make introductions, how to hold a teacup, how to stand in a group without fidgeting. There were even rules about your facial expression, because a poised young woman wore a serene, agreeable look at all times, never scowling, never letting the strain show. It was a full curriculum in being pleasant to look at, taught with the seriousness of a degree program. The honest truth is that some of this genuinely served them. Many women left these lessons with a confidence in their own carriage that lasted a lifetime. The ability to walk into any room, any interview, any intimidating occasion, and simply hold themselves well. There's a real skill in that, and it shouldn't be waved away. But it's worth noticing what the training was for. It polished young women into graceful, composed, decorative versions of themselves, optimized above all for being observed. Poise, in this world, was armor, and it was also a kind of cage. So you practiced. You balanced the book, you crossed your ankles, you glided down the staircase as though the society photographers were already waiting at the bottom. You learned to hold a serene smile while your back ached and your feet throbbed in their sensible heels. And one day it became automatic. This beautiful, effortful poise, so deeply trained that you'd carry it for decades. You could walk into any room like you owned it. You just weren't allowed to look like it had cost you anything. It's time to eat, and eating, like everything else here, comes with a rule book. Meals are communal, served family style at long tables, and they are governed by an etiquette so precise it borders on the surgical. You wait to be seated. You wait to begin. You navigate a small armory of forks and spoons, each with an assigned purpose and a long memory. Elbows stay off the table, napkins stay in laps, and conversation stays pleasant, even when the girl across from you stole your cardigan and your date in the same week. The house mother presides at the head like a benevolent monarch, and one wrong reach for the butter can earn you a look that lands somewhere between disappointment and a court-martial. Dinner isn't a meal here, it's a daily exam. Let's set the scene properly, because the formality might surprise you. This was not a cafeteria where you grabbed a tray and slumped into a chair. In many houses, dinner especially was a structured, almost ceremonial affair. You arrived on time and properly dressed, no slacks, no shortcuts. You stood behind your chair until the house mother was seated and grace was said. Servers, or sisters on kitchen duty, brought the food family style in great dishes to be passed around the table. There was an order to everything, a rhythm, a set of expectations that everyone was assumed to know, and woe betide the freshman who didn't. The cutlery alone was a minefield. A formal place setting could feature an intimidating spread of forks, knives and spoons, each assigned to a specific course and a specific task, and using the wrong one was a small public stumble noticed by everyone who mattered. You learned to work from the outside in, to handle your soup spoon correctly, to rest your utensils at the proper angle to signal you were finished. It was like diffusing a bomb where the wires were all silver and the explosion was social rather than literal. One confident, incorrect reach for the fish fork, and you felt the temperature at the table drop by several degrees. Then came the rules of the body and the conversation, which were just as strict. Elbows off the table, always. Napkin in your lap, never tucked into your collar like a man at a clam bake. You chewed with your mouth closed, you didn't speak with food in it. You waited your turn, and you kept the conversation light, pleasant, and appropriate. Heavy topics were discouraged. Arguments were unthinkable. You could be seething at the girl across the table, the one who had borrowed your good sweater and never returned it, and you were still expected to pass her the rolls with a gracious smile. The table demanded harmony, whether or not harmony actually existed, and presiding over it all sat the house mother, or a senior member, at the head of the table like a queen surveying her court. She set the tone, she modelled the manners, and she missed nothing. A lapse in etiquette didn't require a scolding, it required only the look, that practised expression of gentle disappointment that could make a grown young woman want to slide under the table and disappear. The whole system trained you, meal by meal, in the graces expected of a hostess, because the unspoken assumption was that you'd be running a refined household of your own before long. Dinner was rehearsal, you just didn't always know for what. So you sat up straight, kept your elbows in check, and navigated your armoury of forks from the outside in. You passed the butter the correct way, made pleasant conversation with the sweater thief, and waited for permission to leave the table. And when the meal finally ended and you escaped to your room, you could exhale at last, having survived another formal dinner with your manners and your dignity intact. There would be another one tomorrow, of course. There was always another one tomorrow. Let's talk about the single most powerful number in your existence, curfew. The doors of the house lock at a fixed hour, and that hour is not a suggestion, a guideline, or something you can sweet-talk your way around. You sign out when you leave and sign in when you return, and a ledger somewhere records your every coming and going like a tiny judgmental biography. Miss curfew and the consequences arrive swiftly. The locked door, the woken house mother, the walk of shame past every window. The boys at the fraternity across the street faced nothing of the kind, of course, because in 1963 the rules of the night applied almost exclusively to women. So you learn to watch the clock, to time your good nights, and to sprint in heels across a lawn like an Olympic athlete with a 10 o'clock deadline. Let's start with how rigid the system actually was. Women's hours, as they were often called, were set by the school and enforced by the house, and they were not generous. On weeknights the doors might lock early, surprisingly early by any modern standard. Weekends bought you a little more time, an hour or two, treated like a precious gift. The exact hour varied by school and by year, but the principle never did. A young woman was expected to be home, signed in, and accounted for by a fixed time every single night, no exceptions worth mentioning. Your evening didn't end when you were ready for it to end. It ended when the ledger said it did. The signing in and out was its own quiet ritual of control. You recorded when you left, where you were headed, and when you returned, an honest paper trail of your whereabouts maintained for the house mother's review. This wasn't treated as an insult. It was simply how things were, the accepted machinery of keeping young women safe and respectable. But step back from it and the reality is striking. A house full of bright adult women, logging their movements like soldiers reporting for duty, their freedom measured out in signatures and clock faces. You couldn't simply decide to stay out. There was no such thing as losing track of time. The time was always, relentlessly the point, and here is where the unfairness becomes impossible to ignore. The men across the street, the fraternity boys living the mirror image of your college life, faced almost none of this. They came and went as they pleased. No ledger, no locked doors, no house mother waiting in a robe. The curfews, the sign-outs, the elaborate apparatus of supervision fell on the women alone, built on the era's deep and rarely questioned assumption that a young woman's virtue was fragile, valuable, and the responsibility of everyone but herself. 2 sets of rules for the same campus, the same age, the same nights. One set locked at 10, the other didn't lock at all. The consequences of getting it wrong were genuinely dreaded. Arrive late and you'd find the doors secured, forcing you to rouse the house mother and submit to her judgment in the small hours. Late minutes were sometimes tallied and punished, and a pattern of them could land you in front of the standards board and earn you the dreaded sentence of being campused, confined to the house, your social life suspended. So a missed goodnight wasn't a minor thing. It could cost you the very dances and dates the whole exhausting system was supposedly arranged to deliver. The clock didn't just rule your evening, it ruled the entire shape of your romantic life. So you watched the time like a hawk. You cut the goodnight short, untangled yourself from a perfectly nice evening, and bolted across the lawn with your heels in your hand and your heart pounding, racing a deadline you didn't choose. You made it through the door with seconds to spare, breathless, and signed the ledger with a steady hand as though nothing at all had happened. Freedom for a young woman of this era came with a closing time, and the door, you can be sure, was already locking behind you. Now let's discuss the unofficial major that nobody listed in the course catalogue but everybody understood, the Emrys degree. For a great many young women of the era, college was openly framed as a hunting ground, and the prize was not a diploma, but a husband, ideally a well-bred one with prospects and a future in something respectable. The pressure was enormous and came from every direction: parents, peers, magazines, and the quiet horror of being 22 and unattached. Your studies mattered, but your social calendar mattered more, because a degree was lovely and a ring was the actual point. It's a strange thing to look back on, an entire institution gently nudging brilliant women toward a single life goal. But that was the water everyone was swimming in, and you'd better learn to swim. Let's unpack the term itself because it tells you everything. The Emrys degree was a wry, knowing joke and also a deadly serious expectation that a young woman attended college at least partly, and often primarily, to secure a husband. The pun was on Mrs., the title she hoped to earn, and the joke landed because everybody recognised the truth in it. Higher education for women was, in much of mainstream culture, still treated as a finishing touch, a refining experience, a respectable place to meet a respectable man, rather than the launch pad for a career it was for their brothers. You could pursue a real degree, and many did, but the question hanging over you was rarely about your major. It was about your prospects. The pressure arrived from every conceivable direction and rarely let up. Parents who'd sent you off with hopes that were not primarily academic. Magazines stuffed with advice on catching and keeping a man. A wider culture that measured a young woman's success by the ring on her finger and the wedding date on the calendar. And the peer pressure, sharpest of all, the quiet competition of watching sisters get pinned, then lavaliered, then engaged, while you remained unattached and increasingly aware of it. There was even a phrase for the ideal timeline, the ring by spring, that cheerful, suffocating little rhyme that turned your final semesters into a countdown. To graduate without a fiancé felt, to many, like graduating with an incomplete. The sorority sat at the heart of this whole enterprise, whether it meant to or not. The exchanges, the mixers, the serenades, the carefully chaperoned introductions to suitable young men, all of it functioned in part as an elaborate matchmaking machine. Your social calendar wasn't merely fun, it was strategic, a series of opportunities to meet the kind of man the system approved of. The progression of romantic milestones, his pin, his fraternity lavalière, the eventual ring was tracked and celebrated by the whole house, each step a public advancement toward the great goal. A pinning was announced with ceremony, an engagement was a triumph for everyone, and here is the quiet tragedy folded into the comedy of it all. These were intelligent, capable, ambitious young women, fully able to build careers, lead, create, and change the world, and a great many of them were being gently steered toward a single, narrow definition of success. Some wanted exactly that life and found real happiness in it, and there is nothing to mock in that. But others felt the walls of the expectation pressing in, sensed there might be more on offer than a wedding and a household, and had precious little permission to say so out loud. The Emrys degree was funny precisely because it was true, and it was sad for the very same reason. So you played the game because nearly everyone did. You attended the exchanges, you let yourself be introduced, You noticed who got pinned and felt the clock ticking in the back of your mind. Maybe you wanted the ring with your whole heart, or maybe you wanted something the era couldn't quite imagine for you, or maybe, like most, you wanted a confusing tangle of both. Either way, you swam in the water you were given. The diploma, when it came, was real and earned and yours. But everyone knew which degree the world was really watching for, and spring, as always, was coming. Let's talk about visiting hours, the carefully choreographed ballet of being permitted to see a boy without ever, under any circumstances, being alone with one. When gentlemen callers were allowed inside at all, the rules were strict and often hilariously specific. Doors stayed open, lights stayed on. A chaperone hovered nearby with the watchful patience of a cat at a fishbowl, and in many houses there was the legendary rule of the floor. When a young woman entertained a visitor on a bed or sofa, a certain number of feet were required to remain firmly planted on the ground at all times, the logic being that virtue apparently lived in your shoes. It was surveillance disguised as hospitality, and everyone played their part in the performance. Let's start with where boys were even allowed to exist, because the answer was barely anywhere. The upstairs, where the bedrooms were, was strictly forbidden territory, a sealed kingdom no male foot could enter. Gentlemen callers were received downstairs in the parlour or the front room, in full view of anyone who happened to pass, which was always several someones. The geography itself was a rule. A boy could court you, charm you, and bring you flowers, but he did it in a designated zone under designated conditions, like a visitor at a very polite, very floral prison. Then there was the open door principle, which had the elegance of a law and the subtlety of a foghorn. If you and a young man were in a room together, that door stayed open, wide open, and the light stayed on. The idea of a closed door was practically scandalous on its face, an invitation to assume the worst. So romance, such as it was, unfolded in bright light with the door flung open to the hallway, every tender word potentially overheard, every lingering look potentially witnessed. It was about as private as a goldfish bowl on a kitchen table, and that was entirely the point. And then, the rule that has outlived nearly all the others in memory, the matter of feet. The famous standard held that a certain number of feet, often 3 between the two of you, had to stay on the floor at all moments. The arithmetic was deliberately awkward. 2 people, 4 feet, 3 required to remain grounded, which meant that at any given second, exactly 1 foot was permitted the dangerous luxury of leaving the floor. The rule was absurd, and everyone knew it was absurd, and it was enforced anyway, because its real purpose wasn't the feat at all. It was the reminder, constant and unmissable, that you were being watched and were never to forget it. The chaperone made sure of that. Whether it was the house mother, a senior member, or some designated guardian, there was almost always an adult presence nearby during visiting hours, near enough to see, near enough to hear, near enough to materialize at exactly the wrong moment. She didn't have to do much. She simply had to be there, a quiet, watchful fixture that turned every visit into a performance of propriety. You behaved beautifully, not because you'd necessarily have done otherwise, but because behaving was the only option the architecture allowed. So you sat in the bright parlour with your young man, door open, lights blazing, chaperone drifting past with feline patience, and you kept your feet, all the required ones, dutifully on the floor. You held a perfectly respectable conversation while an entire house pretended not to listen. And if your heart fluttered a little anyway, well, that was your own business, the one thing the rules couldn't quite reach. Romance, in this house, was a spectator sport. You just learned to play it with your shoes on. Now let's discuss the single most contested object in the entire house, the telephone. There was usually 1, maybe 2 for dozens of girls, mounted in a hallway with zero privacy and a line of impatient sisters forming behind you. Calls were timed, messages were scribbled on a communal board, and a boy hoping to reach you had to run a gauntlet of whoever answered first. Long, dreamy conversations with a sweetheart happened in full earshot of anyone passing by, which meant your most tender words became instant public property. Hog the phone, and you'd earn the collective fury of the house. It was the original group chat, except everyone could hear you, judge you, and remember every word you said for the rest of the semester. Let's appreciate the sheer scarcity of the thing. In an age before a phone lived in every pocket, the house telephone was a single shared lifeline to the outside world, and dozens of young women all needed it for the same reasons at the same times. There might be one in the hallway, perhaps another tucked into some semi-public nook, and that was the entire communications infrastructure for the whole sisterhood. Demand wildly outstripped supply. The result was a permanent low-grade conflict over a hunk of plastic bolted to the wall, a resource so precious it may as well have been a watering hole on the savannah. The lack of privacy was total and unavoidable. That phone hung in a corridor where everyone passed, which meant your conversations belonged, in practice, to the public. You could whisper, you could turn your back, you could cup your hand over the receiver, and it made no difference. The girl heading to her room heard you, the girl waiting in line heard you, and by morning your sweet nothings had been faithfully reported to half the house. Pouring your heart out to a boy while three sisters loitered nearby pretending to read the bulletin board was simply the cost of having a heart to pour out. Romance once again came with an audience. To manage the chaos, houses developed systems, and the systems had rules. Calls were often time-limited, especially during busy evening hours, so that no single girl could monopolize the line while everyone else waited. Whoever answered became, instantly, an unpaid switchboard operator, taking down names and scribbling messages onto a communal board or a stack of little slips. If a boy called for you while you were out, your romantic fate rested entirely on whether some distracted sister remembered to write it down and whether you ever found the note. Many a promising courtship was wounded by a message that slipped behind the radiator, and the social enforcement was ruthless. Stay on too long and you'd feel the heat of the queue behind you, the pointed sighs, the tapping feet, the muttered remarks that grew less muttered by the minute. Hogging the phone was a genuine offence against the community, a selfish act with collective consequences, and the house remembered. The girl who treated the shared line like her personal property earned a reputation for exactly that. And reputations, as we'll come to, were not lightly shrugged off in this world. Even the way you used the telephone was somehow a measure of your character. So you took your place in line, waited your turn, and conducted your most private conversations in the most public spot in the house. You kept it short, mindful of the sisters behind you, and you said your tender goodbyes to a boy while an entire corridor pretended very hard not to listen. Then you hung up, surrendered the receiver to the next girl in line, and walked away knowing that whatever you just said was now, officially, common knowledge. One phone, dozens of hearts, zero privacy. Somehow romance survived it anyway. Let's go back to the beginning, to the terrifying ordeal that started it all. Rush. For one frantic, smiling, perfumed week, you visited house after house, performing friendliness at an industrial scale, while being silently evaluated on your clothes, your conversation, your family, your manners, and some ineffable quality the older girls called fit. Behind closed doors, the sisters debated your worthiness like a parole board. You waited by the mail for the slip of paper that would decide where and whether you belonged. It was a job interview, a beauty pageant, and a first date all stacked into one shaking week. And the cruelest part was that you had to look like you were having the time of your life the entire time, even as your future hung on the opinions of strangers. Let's walk through how the gauntlet actually ran. Rush, or recruitment, was a structured process of rounds, and with each round the field narrowed. In the early rounds you visited many houses, briefly a whirlwind of parlours and punch and bright practised conversation. Then came the invitation back, or the absence of them, as houses signalled their interest and you signalled yours. The rounds grew longer and more intimate, the parties more elaborate, the stakes higher, until at last came preference, the final formal courtship, and then the mutual matching that decided where you landed. It was a multi-day marathon of smiling, and your feet, your face, and your nerves all paid the price. The evaluation was relentless and ran in both directions, though it rarely felt that way to the trembling freshman. You were judged on everything at once: your appearance, your poise, your wardrobe, your ease in conversation, your background, your connections, and that maddening undefined quality of whether you'd fit. Some houses cared deeply about a girl's family, her hometown, her social pedigree, the kind of information that got quietly traded and weighed. You were in effect being assessed as a potential lifelong member of a club, and the assessment was thorough, swift, and not always kind. A single awkward silence could cost you a callback you'd never even know you'd lost. Behind the closed doors, the sisters did their own grim accounting. After the parties ended and the rushies went home, the members gathered to discuss each candidate, compare impressions, and decide who advanced and who didn't. It was a frank, sometimes brutal process, conducted out of earshot, and the verdicts could turn on the thinnest of margins. A comment that landed wrong, an outfit that missed, a vague sense that someone wasn't quite right. The young woman being discussed had no idea, of course. She was at home, replaying every conversation, wondering what they'd thought, waiting. And the waiting was the worst of it. After all the smiling and the small talk and the careful performance, your fate arrived in the form of a slip of paper, an invitation, a bid, or the silence that meant rejection. Bid day brought euphoria for some and quiet heartbreak for others, the sorting of an entire freshman class into the belonging and the left out, all in a single morning. For the girls who matched with the house they dreamed of, it was pure joy. For those who didn't, it was a wound that the cheerful chaos of the day did nothing to soften. So you ran the gauntlet. You smiled until your face ached, made bright conversation in parlour after parlour, and tried to be effortlessly delightful while a week's worth of strangers quietly decided your future. You waited by the mail with your stomach in knots, and whatever the slip of paper said, you'd learned the first great lesson of the sisterhood before you'd even joined it. That belonging here was something you auditioned for, and the audition never entirely ended. So you got the bid, you said yes, and now you're a pledge, which is a polite word for the lowest rung on a very tall ladder. Pledges fetched, cleaned, ran errands, memorised history, and learned to address every older member with the proper deference. You wore your pledge pin like a beacon announcing your junior status to the world. You answered the door, you answered the phone, you answered for everything. The active members held all the power and weren't shy about using it, and your job was to absorb the lessons, prove your devotion, and earn the right to call yourself a real sister. It was a months-long endurance test wrapped in the language of love and tradition. Mostly, it taught you to smile while carrying somebody else's laundry. Let's be clear about where you stood, which was firmly at the bottom. As a pledge, you were a member in training, accepted but not yet initiated, belonging but not yet belonging fully. That in-between status came with a long list of duties and a short list of privileges. You wore a distinct pledge pin, smaller and humbler than the real badge, marking you instantly as a newcomer to anyone who knew how to read it. It was a little announcement you carried on your chest, still proving herself. And prove yourself you would, in 100 small ways, every single day. The duties piled up quickly. Pledges often handled the thankless work of the house. answering the door and the telephone, running messages, helping with chores, fetching things for the older members who'd earned the right to ask. There was a clear hierarchy, and you were beneath it, expected to show deference to the actives, to greet them properly, to remember your place with a smile. None of this was framed as servitude, of course. It was framed as learning the house, paying your dues, earning your stripes. But the laundry was real, and so were the errands, and so was the unmistakable sense that your time was not entirely your own. Then there was the studying, because pledging was, among other things, an education. You memorized the history of the organization, its founders, its symbols, its values, its long roll of traditions. There were tests, sometimes literal ones, on the law you were expected to absorb. You learned the songs, the mottos, the meanings behind the rituals you weren't yet permitted to fully witness. It was homework on top of your actual homework, a second curriculum in devotion, and it served a purpose. By the time you were initiated, the house would be written into your memory, its story made part of your own. And underneath the chores and the deference and the memorization ran the real project of the whole period, bonding. The pledge class, all of you at the bottom together, became a unit, forged by shared labour and shared low status into something close to family. You complained together, covered for each other, survived the demands as a group, and in doing so built the friendships that would, in many cases, outlast everything else about the experience. The hierarchy was real, but so was the closeness it created, and that was no accident. The system knew exactly what it was doing, so you pledged. You answered the door, ran the errands, carried the laundry and memorized the history, all while wearing your little pin and your big smile. You leaned on your pledge sisters and they leaned on you, and somewhere in the middle of all that fetching and studying and deferring, you stopped feeling quite so much like an outsider. You were earning your way in, one humble task at a time. The real badge was coming. You just had to survive the road to it first. Now we arrive at the chapter nobody outside the house was ever supposed to hear about. The final stretch before initiation, known in many places by a name that says it all. The details varied, and the truly cruel versions were against the rules even then, but for the pledges living through it, the week often meant exhaustion, strange tasks, sleep deprivation, and a barrage of demands designed to test loyalty right up to the breaking point. You were tired, frazzled, and bound by an oath of secrecy so total that to this day former members go quiet when you ask. Then, at the very end, came the ceremony, the candlelight, the solemn vows, and suddenly the misery dissolved into belonging. You'd survived. You were in. And you'd never, ever tell anyone what happened. Let's be honest about what this final stretch was meant to do. The whole point was the test. A concentrated period of demands designed to push pledges, to wear them down, to prove their commitment before they crossed the threshold into full membership. The activities ranged widely from house to house, and year to year, from the silly and harmless to, in the worst cases, the genuinely punishing. The mild end might mean tedious tasks, odd assignments, late nights, and the steady grind of being run ragged. It was endurance theatre, a manufactured hardship with a meaningful reward waiting on the other side. The exhaustion was often the engine of it. Sleep grew scarce, schedules grew strange, and the constant demands left pledges frazzled and foggy, which was rather the idea. A tired mind bonds hard to whatever it survives, and surviving together, half asleep and stretched thin, welded the pledge class into something fierce and permanent. You leaned on each other because there was no one else to lean on, and the shared ordeal became, paradoxically, one of the strongest bonds the whole experience produced. Misery, it turns out, makes excellent glue. It's worth saying plainly that the cruelest versions of all this were against the rules even then, and have only become more so since. Organisations had standards, and the genuinely dangerous hazing that sometimes occurred violated them. We're not here to glamorise that, and we won't dwell on it, because there's nothing soothing or funny about young people being harmed in the name of tradition. The version worth remembering tonight is the more common one. Tiring, strange, occasionally absurd, but ultimately survivable. A rite of passage that most look back on with a complicated mix of exhaustion and pride. And then there was the secrecy, which was, and remains, near total. What happened in those final days was sealed behind an oath, a promise of silence that members took with genuine seriousness. Ask a woman decades later what really went on and watch her smile, shake her head, and change the subject. The secrecy wasn't just about hiding embarrassment. It was part of the magic, the sense that you'd been admitted to something hidden, something earned, something the outside world would never fully know. The silence itself was a kind of belonging, so you endured it, whatever it was. You went without sleep, you completed the strange tasks, you leaned on your pledge sisters and they leaned on you, and you kept your mouth shut about all of it. And then, at the very end, the demands fell away and the ceremony arrived. The candles, the solemn words, the moment you stopped being a pledge and became at last a full sister. The exhaustion melted into something warm and overwhelming. You'd made it. You were in. And the secret of exactly how you got there, that you'd carry to your grave smiling, just like all the sisters before you. Let's talk about the pin, a small piece of jewellery that carried more rules than a tax form. Once initiated, you wore your badge with pride, but pride came with regulations. The pin had to sit in a precise spot, over the heart, worn correctly, never carelessly, never on the wrong garment, never ever loaned out or lost. It was a sacred object, the physical proof of your membership, and treating it casually was nearly sacrilegious. And then there was the romantic dimension. Giving a boy your pin or accepting his was a serious statement of intention, a step on the long ladder that ran from pinned to engaged to married. A pin was never just a pin. It was a vow, a status symbol, and a tiny metal contract pressed against your chest. Let's begin with what the badge actually meant, because it was no ordinary brooch. The pin was the sacred emblem of the organisation, awarded only upon initiation, the hard-won proof that you'd crossed from pledge to full member. It carried the symbols, the secrets, the entire weight of the sisterhood in a small, often jewelled design. You didn't buy your way to it or pick it off a shelf. You earned it, and that earning gave it a near-holy significance. To a member, the badge wasn't decoration. It was identity, condensed into something you could hold in your palm. Naturally, an object that's sacred came wrapped in rules. The pin was worn over the heart, in a specific position, on appropriate clothing and appropriate occasions. There were conventions about when it could be displayed and when it should be set aside, about keeping it clean, keeping it secure, treating it with the gravity it deserved. Losing your badge was a small catastrophe. Lending it out was unthinkable. Wearing it carelessly, on the wrong garment or in the wrong spirit, was a quiet failure of respect that other members noticed. The thing demanded a level of ceremony that, to an outsider, might seem faintly ridiculous, and to a member was simply correct. Then came the romance, where the pin took on a whole second life. In the courtship rituals of the era, a young man giving his fraternity pin to a young woman, an act called pinning, was a serious and public declaration, a step beyond casual dating and toward genuine commitment. It often signalled an understanding that engagement might follow, a kind of pre-engagement promise worn visibly on the chest. There was even a related custom involving the smaller fraternity Lavaliere, a necklace bearing his letters, marking an earlier, slightly less binding stage. The progression was understood by all, Lavaliered, then pinned, then engaged, then married, each rung on the ladder more serious than the last. A pinning was a genuine event, celebrated by the whole house. Word would spread, and the sisterhood might mark the occasion with a ritual all its own. A candle passed around a circle, perhaps, the flame and the secrecy building anticipation, until the newly pinned sister revealed her news to delighted squeals. These moments were tracked, treasured, and woven into the social fabric of the house. Your romantic progress wasn't private, it was communal property, a milestone the entire sisterhood shared in and cheered. To be pinned was to be the centre of the world, however briefly. So you wore your badge over your heart, exactly as the rules required, and you guarded it like the sacred thing it was. And if one day a young man offered you his pin, you understood precisely what it meant, the promise it carried, the ladder it placed you on, the squealing celebration that would follow. A small piece of metal, and yet it could announce your membership, your devotion, and your romantic future all at once. 17 rules for one tiny pin. In this world, the smallest objects carried the heaviest meanings, and you learn to handle them accordingly. Here's a rule that may surprise you. You actually had to study. Beneath all the formals and the curfews, sororities took grades seriously, because a chapter's collective grade point average was a matter of public pride and fierce competition. Mandatory study hours were enforced, quiet time was observed, and your academic performance was tracked, posted, and discussed. Fall below the standard and you might find yourself on academic probation, barred from the very social events the whole system seemed to revolve around. It was a strange and genuinely useful pressure, an institution built on appearances that also, almost grudgingly, insisted you use your mind. So you cracked the books, not entirely for yourself, but because letting down the house average was its own quiet disgrace. Let's start with the unexpected truth. The scholarship mattered, and not just as a slogan. Sororities, for all their reputation as social clubs, placed real institutional weight on academics. Each chapter's grades were tallied into a collective average, and that number was visible, compared against other houses, and treated as a genuine source of pride or embarrassment. A house with strong grades wore them like a badge of honour. A house slipping in the rankings felt the pressure keenly. Your private struggle with a chemistry exam was, in a small way, everyone's business, because your performance fed the number that represented all of you. To protect that number, houses imposed structure. Mandatory study hours were common, set blocks of time when members were expected to be at their books, with quiet hours observed throughout the house so that focus was possible. There might be designated study spaces, enforced silence, even sisters assigned to keep an eye on things. For a freshman accustomed to studying whenever she felt like it, this was a jolt. Scholarship treated not as a personal choice, but as a communal obligation, scheduled and supervised like everything else in the house. You studied because it was study time, and study time was the rule. The tracking could be surprisingly rigorous. Grades were monitored, sometimes posted, sometimes discussed, and a girl whose mark slipped would hear about it. There were often standards to maintain, minimums you couldn't drop below without consequence. The whole apparatus turned your transcript into a semi-public document, your academic life into one more thing the house took an interest in. It was intrusive, certainly, but it was also, in its way, a form of support. Plenty of young women studied harder than they otherwise might have, simply because someone was paying attention and the house expected better. And the consequences gave the whole thing teeth. Fall too far, and you might land on academic probation, which often meant being benched from the social calendar, the dances, the exchanges, the very events that made the rest of the regimen feel worthwhile. Your grades and your social life were directly linked, which created a powerful, if slightly cynical, incentive to keep your marks up. Nothing motivated a struggling student quite like the threat of missing the spring formal. The system had figured out with some shrewdness exactly which lever to pull, so you cracked the books during study hours, kept quiet during quiet time, and watched your grades with one eye on your own future and the other on the house average. You studied partly for yourself and partly because falling short would let down the whole sisterhood and possibly cost you the next dance. It was, when you step back to look at it, one of the more genuinely admirable corners of the whole enterprise, an institution obsessed with appearances that nonetheless insisted firmly that its members use their minds. The formals got the attention, but quietly, in the enforced hush of study hours, a great many bright young women were getting the education they'd come for. Funny how that worked. Let's talk about the rules around the things you weren't supposed to do, and how you did them anyway. Smoking was common, often quietly tolerated, sometimes restricted to certain rooms or hours, and wrapped in its own etiquette about how a lady held her cigarette. Drinking was a far thornier matter, officially frowned upon, technically forbidden, and absolutely happening behind closed doors and at fraternity parties across the street. The trick was discretion. A sorority girl could have her vices, but she could never be seen to have them, because the appearance of impropriety was 1,000 times more dangerous than the act itself. So you learned to misbehave quietly, gracefully, and with one ear always tuned for footsteps in the hall. Let's begin with cigarettes, which occupied a strange and contradictory place in this world. Smoking was widespread in the era, glamorized in the magazines, practiced by film stars and society women alike, and a great many sorority girls smoked freely. Yet it came tangled in rules and refinements. Some houses confined smoking to certain rooms, away from the formal spaces and the prying eyes of visitors. There was an entire unspoken etiquette to it, how a lady held her cigarette, how she lit it or allowed it to be lit, how she managed the whole performance with grace rather than crudeness. A woman could smoke, but she was expected to smoke elegantly, like everything else she did. Drinking was a far more dangerous game. Alcohol was, in most houses and on most campuses of the era, officially forbidden to the young women, frowned upon as unbecoming and risky to a girl's reputation. The standards were sharply gendered. A young man drinking was a young man being a young man, while a young woman drinking risked being branded fast, loose, the kind of girl who couldn't be trusted. And yet, of course, the drinking happened, at fraternity parties across the street, at gatherings beyond the house mother's reach, in the spaces where the rules thinned out. The prohibition didn't stop it. It simply pushed it into the shadows and raised the stakes of getting caught. The governing principle behind all of it was discretion, the great mid-century art of appearing virtuous regardless of the underlying facts. What mattered, above almost everything, was not what you did, but what you were seen to do. A young woman could have her vices, her cigarettes, her occasional drink at a party, her small rebellions, provided she kept them invisible, kept them quiet, kept them from ever touching the public image she presented to the house and the world. The sin itself was survivable. The scandal of being caught was not. So you learned to manage appearances with the skill of a diplomat, because appearances were the whole game. This produced a peculiar kind of double life, lived by a great many perfectly respectable young women. In public, you were wholesome, proper, the very picture of a lady. In private, behind a closed door, at a party beyond the watchful eyes, you might be something a little freer, a little more your own. The gap between the two wasn't hypocrisy so much as survival, the necessary navigation of a world that demanded one face in the light and tolerated another in the dark. You weren't being false, you were being careful, which the era required of women far more than men. So you learned to misbehave well. You smoked your cigarette in the permitted room, held with practiced grace. You had your drink at the party across the street and came home composed, signed in on time, betraying nothing. You kept one ear always tuned for footsteps and one eye always on appearances, threading the narrow needle between the girl you presented and the girl you were. It was exhausting, this constant performance of virtue, but you'd mastered it, the way your sisters had before you. In this house, you could sin. You simply had to do it politely, and never, ever get caught. It's Sunday, which means it's time to dress up and prove your virtue in public. Church attendance was strongly encouraged, and in many houses effectively required, and showing up meant looking immaculate. Gloves, hat, your finest modest dress, the whole respectable ensemble. Faith and reputation were tangled together here, because being seen at services said something about your character to everyone watching, and someone was always watching. The house valued a girl who was wholesome, devout, and presentable in roughly that order, and Sunday morning was your weekly opportunity to demonstrate all three at once. Whether or not your heart was in it, your hat certainly was. So you pinned it on, smoothed your gloves, and walked to the pew like the model young woman everyone expected you to be. Let's start with the expectation itself, which was woven deep into the culture of the era. Regular church attendance was simply assumed for a respectable young woman, and many houses made it more than an assumption, encouraging or outright expecting members to attend services each Sunday. Religion was part of the wholesome ideal the whole system was built to produce, and a girl who skipped services without good reason raised eyebrows. Whether the house tracked it formally or simply noticed who went and who didn't, the message was clear. Sunday morning had a destination, and that destination was the pew. The dressing for it was an event in its own right. You did not amble into church in whatever you'd thrown on. You arrived immaculate in your Sunday best, the full, respectable ensemble that the occasion demanded. Gloves, often white, a hat, properly worn, a modest, well-pressed dress, sensible heels, the coordinated accessories that signalled care and propriety. The effort was the point. Showing up looking your finest was itself a kind of statement, a visible demonstration that you took the occasion, and yourself, seriously. You dressed for the eyes of the congregation as much as for any higher purpose, and you knew it. Because here, as everywhere, faith and reputation were thoroughly entangled. Being seen at services said something about your character, broadcast to everyone in attendance and everyone who'd hear about it later. That you were devout, proper, the kind of wholesome young woman the house and the world approved of. The act of attending was partly private devotion and partly public performance, and the proportions varied from girl to girl. Someone was always watching, always noting, always quietly filing away who'd been in the pew and who'd been conspicuously absent. Your spiritual life, like nearly everything else, had an audience. This put a great many young women in a familiar position, going through the motions of something that may or may not have stirred their hearts, because the motions themselves were what the world rewarded. Some attended with genuine faith and found real comfort in it. Others went because it was expected, because skipping carried a cost, because a respectable girl was a church-going girl and that was simply that. The system didn't much care which it was. It cared that you were there, dressed beautifully, demonstrating the wholesome character the house prized. Your inner life was your own. Your attendance was the house's business. So you pinned on your hat, smoothed your white gloves, and walked to the pew looking every inch the model young woman. You sat through the service, properly attired, properly devout, properly seen, fulfilling an expectation that blended faith and reputation until you couldn't quite tell them apart. Maybe your heart was in it, and maybe it wasn't, but your hat certainly was, perched at exactly the right angle for a Sunday morning. In this world, virtue was something you wore, something you performed, something you demonstrated weekly in your finest clothes, and you did, like clockwork, dress to impress a congregation and a sisterhood that were, as ever, watching. Now let's talk about the most valuable and most fragile thing you owned, your reputation. In this world, what people believed about you mattered every bit as much as what was true, and an entire economy ran on whispered information. A single rumour about being too friendly with a boy, too loose with your curfew, too anything, could follow you for years and shape how every door in your social life opened or slammed. The word fast was a quiet weapon, deployed with devastating effect. So you guarded your image like treasure, monitored your every move, and navigated a constant, exhausting social calculus. The sisterhood could lift you up, but it could also, with a few well-placed words, gently take you apart, and everyone knew it. Let's start with why reputation carried such enormous weight. In an era that judged a young woman's worth heavily by her perceived virtue and respectability, your good name was, quite literally, one of your most important assets. It shaped how you were treated, who courted you, which doors opened, and how far you could go socially. And crucially, it rested not on what you'd actually done, but on what people believed you'd done, which meant your reputation was always to some degree out of your own hands. You could be entirely proper and still suffer from a well-placed rumour. The truth was almost beside the point. Perception was everything. This gave gossip the force of currency, and the house ran on it. Information about who'd done what, who'd been seen where, who'd come in late and climbed out of whose car, travelled through the sisterhood at remarkable speed and was traded, weighed and remembered. The same closeness that made the house feel like family also made it a perfect engine for rumour. Dozens of young women living on top of each other, watching, noticing, talking. A whispered observation in the hallway could reach the whole house by dinner and the whole campus by the weekend. In this economy, secrets were valuable, and silence was rarely on offer. The most dangerous word in the whole vocabulary was fast. That small, sharp label applied to a young woman thought to be too free with boys, too loose in her conduct, too willing to bend the rules of propriety. To be called fast was to suffer real social damage, a stain on the reputation that could prove difficult to wash out. The accusation didn't require proof. It required only enough whispers to take hold. And the standard was brutally uneven, falling on women in ways it never fell on the men they were supposedly too friendly with. A single misjudged evening could define a young woman for years, while the boy involved walked away untouched. So you learned to manage your image with constant, exhausting vigilance. You watched where you went and who you were seen with. You minded your curfew not just for the house mother's sake, but for the story it told. You guarded your conduct, your associations, your every visible move, always aware that an audience was taking notes and that the notes had consequences. It was a heavy, low-level anxiety to carry, the knowledge that your standing could shift on the strength of a rumour you might never even hear. Living under that kind of scrutiny shaped how these women moved through the world, often long after they'd left the house. So you guarded your reputation like the treasure it was, because in this world that's exactly what it was. You navigated the endless social calculus, mindful of perception, wary of the whispers, careful never to hand anyone the wrong story to tell. The sisterhood gave you belonging, friendship, a family of sorts, and it could also, with a few quiet words, unravel everything you'd built. Both were true at once. That was the bargain. You lived inside a community that held you close and watched you closely in the very same breath, and you learned, as every sister did, to keep one careful eye on your own good name. It was the most valuable thing you owned. It was also the easiest to lose. Let's discuss what happened when you broke the rules, because there was a system for that, and it had teeth. Many houses ran a standards or judiciary board, a panel of your peers who sat in judgment over infractions large and small. Come in late, dress improperly, embarrass the house, or stray from the code, and you might find yourself summoned to explain yourself. The classic punishment was being campused, confined to the house, stripped of your social privileges, benched from the dates and dances that made the whole ordeal feel worthwhile. It was discipline administered by the very women you lived with, which made it sting all the more. Your sisters could be your greatest comfort, and when you slipped, your jury. Let's start with what the Standards Board actually was, because it was a genuinely formal institution. Most houses had some version of it. A committee or council of members tasked with upholding the rules, hearing about infractions and deciding what to do about them. It wasn't run by adults or outside authorities. It was run by your own sisters, often elected or appointed to the role, given real power over the conduct of the house. The name varied: standards, judiciary, the House Council, but the function was the same: to keep members in line and to deal with those who strayed. It was self-governance, peer enforcement, the community policing itself from within. The offences that could land you before it ran the full range from trivial to serious. Coming in past curfew, dressing improperly, conduct that reflected badly on the house, anything that touched on the precious matter of reputation. Behaviour unbecoming of a member, however, that was defined in a given house in a given year. The rules were many, and so were the ways to break them, and the board existed precisely to handle the inevitable. A girl who slipped up might find herself summoned to explain, to account for herself before a panel of the very people she ate breakfast with. There was something uniquely uncomfortable about being judged by your friends. This signature punishment was being campused, a sentence dreaded across the whole house. To be campused meant losing your privileges, confined to the house, barred from going out socially, benched from the dances and dates and exchanges for a set period. It was a kind of grounding, administered not by parents but by peers, and it struck at exactly the thing that made the rest of the regimen tolerable: your social life. A campused sister watched from the window as the others left for the evening, serving out her sentence in the house she couldn't escape. For a young woman whose calendar was the heart of her college experience, it was a real and painful loss. What gave the whole system its peculiar sting was that it came from within. This wasn't a distant administrator handing down a ruling. It was the sisterhood itself, the women who comforted you when you cried and lent you their cardigans, now sitting in judgment over your conduct. The community that held you close also held you accountable, and the two roles lived in the same faces. It bound the house together in a strange way, this shared responsibility for one another's behaviour, but it also meant there was nowhere to hide. Your jury knew you intimately. They'd seen you at your best and were now contemplating your worst. So you minded the rules, because the alternative was a summons, a hearing, and quite possibly a stretch of being campused while your sisters went out without you. You kept your curfew, watched your conduct, and protected the house's good name, all under the steady awareness that the community enforced its own code. The sisterhood could be your refuge and your tribunal in the same breath, and you learned to live with both. They were your greatest comfort. They were also, when you crossed the line, your jury. In this house, those were never quite separate things. Let's talk about the mysteries, the parts of sorority life sealed away from outsiders entirely. Every house had its rituals, the secret handshake, the secret songs, the mottos and symbols and ceremonies passed down with grave seriousness from one generation to the next. There were things you learned only after initiation, things written in ritual books guarded as carefully as state secrets. things you swore never to reveal. To the outside world it looked like harmless pageantry, but inside these traditions were the spiritual backbone of the whole enterprise, the glue that turned a house full of strangers into something that called itself a family. You memorized the words, you kept the secrets, and you became part of a chain stretching back decades. Some of those secrets are still kept today. Let's begin with the sheer volume of hidden knowledge involved, because there was a great deal of it. Beyond the public face of the sorority, the parties and the letters and the matching sweaters, lay an entire private world of ritual reserved for initiated members alone. There were ceremonies with specific words and specific steps. There were symbols whose meanings were explained only to sisters. There was a handshake, a grip known to members and no one else, a small physical password that quietly identified one sister to another. To join was to be admitted gradually into a body of secret knowledge, and the admission itself was part of what made membership feel significant. The songs and the rituals carried real weight, performed with a seriousness that might surprise an outsider. These weren't silly campfire chants. They were treated as sacred, sung at ceremonies and gatherings, tied to the values and the history of the organization. A sister learned them, internalized them, and performed them alongside women who'd performed the same words in the same way for generations. There was genuine beauty in that continuity, the sense of voices joining a chorus that stretched back decades and would stretch forward decades more. The rituals connected you to something larger than your own 4 years, a tradition you were now charged with carrying. The ritual books themselves were guarded with near paranoid care, and that secrecy was sincere. The texts containing the most sacred ceremonies and meanings were kept private, shown only to members, sometimes never permitted to leave the house, treated as treasures not to be exposed to outside eyes. Revealing the contents was a serious breach, an offence against the sisterhood and the oath you'd taken. To this day, much of this material remains genuinely secret, faithfully kept by women who took their promises seriously, which is its own quiet testament to how much the rituals meant. People keep secrets for decades only when those secrets matter to them, and underneath all the pageantry, the rituals did something powerful and very real. They transformed a collection of individuals into a unified body with a shared identity, a common language, a sense of belonging to something with depth and history. The secrets bound the members together, the shared knowledge marking the line between sister and stranger. Memorizing the words, learning the handshake, participating in the ceremonies, all of it built the intimacy and the loyalty that defined the experience. The mystery wasn't incidental to the sisterhood. It was in many ways the engine of it. So you learned it all. You memorized the songs, mastered the handshake, sat through the ceremonies, and absorbed the meanings of the symbols you'd once seen only from the outside. You took your oath of secrecy and you kept it, joining a chain of women stretching back through the years, each one entrusted with the same hidden knowledge. To outsiders it might look like elaborate make-believe, and perhaps in part it was. But to you now, on the inside, it was the spiritual core of the whole thing, the secret heart that turned a house full of strangers into sisters. And those secrets, you'd keep them faithfully for the rest of your life. Now for the social engine that powered everything, the elaborate dance between the sorority and the fraternity across the way. There were exchanges, mixers, serenades sung beneath windows on warm evenings, and a whole calendar of carefully orchestrated occasions designed to introduce respectable young women to respectable young men under maximum supervision. A serenade could send an entire house rushing to the windows in their curlers, swooning over a fraternity belting out a song in the dark. It was romantic, it was theatrical, and it was monitored down to the minute. The whole system existed to make matches while preventing anything scandalous from actually happening. which is a needle so fine it's a wonder anyone ever got engaged at all. And yet, somehow, they did. Let's start with the exchange, the workhorse of the social calendar. An exchange, sometimes called a mixer, was an organised social event between a sorority and a fraternity, a sanctioned occasion for the two houses to mingle. There might be a theme, refreshments, music, structured activities designed to break the ice and keep things moving. These weren't wild parties. They were chaperoned, time-bound, carefully arranged affairs whose real purpose was introduction. Young women met young men in a controlled environment that the adults could observe, which was precisely the appeal. Romance was encouraged, but only the supervised, respectable kind. Then there was the serenade, the most theatrical tradition of them all. Picture a warm evening, the sorority house quiet when suddenly the sound of male voices rises from the lawn below. A fraternity has come to serenade the house, or perhaps one particular sister, singing beneath the windows in the gathering dark. The effect was electric. Girls would rush to the windows in their curlers and robes, leaning out, swooning, squealing, thrilled by the spectacle of it. A serenade might mark a special occasion, a pinning, a celebration, or simply a grand romantic gesture, and it turned an ordinary evening into something out of a film. It was courtship as performance, and the whole house was the audience. The entire apparatus was built around supervision, because that was the era's solution to the problem of young people and romance. Every sanctioned event was chaperoned, scheduled, and monitored, designed to allow courtship while preventing anything that might threaten a reputation. The fraternity men and the sorority women could meet, mingle, flirt, and pair off, but always within boundaries, always under watchful eyes, always within the bright lines of propriety. The goal was matchmaking without scandal, romance without risk, a contradiction the whole system tried gamely to manage through sheer relentless oversight. And the function beneath all the fun was deadly serious. This was where the matches got made. The exchanges and serenades and mixers weren't merely entertainment. They were the social machinery through which young women met the young men they might lavalier, then pin, then marry. The whole calendar fed the great goal of the era, the pairing off that the culture prized above nearly everything. Each event was an opportunity, each introduction a possibility, each warm evening another chance for the ladder of romance to advance a rung. Fun, yes, but purposeful fun with the future quietly riding on it. So you joined the dance because the dance was the whole point. You attended the exchanges, mingled under watchful eyes, and rushed to the window with your sisters when the serenade rose from the lawn below. You let yourself be courted within the bright lines of propriety, met the suitable young men the system was built to deliver, and played your part in the carefully supervised theatre of romance. It was monitored, scheduled, and chaperoned within an inch of its life, a needle so fine it seemed impossible to thread. And yet, evening by evening, song by song, the matches got made anyway. Love, it turns out, is stubborn even with the chaperone in the room. Let's head into housekeeping, because a proper house ran spotless, and proving it was practically a sport. The legendary white glove inspection was exactly what it sounds like. Someone, often the house mother, would run a gloved finger along a shelf, a sill, a banister, and if it came away anything less than pristine, there would be words. Chores were assigned, duties rotated, and cleanliness wasn't merely expected. It was a reflection of the entire house's character. You scrubbed, you dusted, you polished surfaces that were already gleaming, all in service of an ideal of domestic perfection that doubled neatly as training for the household you were apparently destined to run someday. The house was beautiful. Keeping it that way was your unpaid second job. Let's start with the standard, which was nothing short of immaculate. The house was a showplace, a reflection of the sisterhood's character, and it was expected to look the part at all times. Tidy, polished, presentable to any visitor who might appear. This wasn't optional or occasional. A clean house was a point of pride and a matter of reputation, and the members were responsible for maintaining it. Whether or not professional help was involved, the daily upkeep, the tidying and dusting and ordering of the common spaces often fell to the members themselves, with the pledges frequently carrying the heaviest load. The gleaming parlour didn't gleam by itself. The famous inspection gave the standard its enforcement. The white glove check was a real practice, theatrical and effective in equal measure. A gloved finger drawn across a surface, a shelf, a sill, the top of a door frame, to reveal any dust the eye might miss. If the glove came away soiled, the cleaning had failed, and the responsible parties would hear about it. The white glove turned cleanliness into something measurable, a test you could pass or fail in an instant, and it left no room for the casual once-over. You couldn't merely appear to clean. You had to clean to a standard that would survive a fingertip and a critical eye. The work itself was organised with real structure. Chores were assigned and rotated, duties distributed across the membership, so the burden, in theory, fell fairly. There were schedules, expectations, areas of responsibility. Members took turns with the various tasks of keeping a large, busy house in order, and the pledges naturally drew much of the grunt work as part of paying their dues. It was communal labour in service of a communal standard, and it ran on the same logic as everything else in the house: shared responsibility, shared consequences, shared pride in the result. And there was a quiet purpose threaded through all the scrubbing, one the error rarely stated but clearly intended. The relentless emphasis on domestic perfection doubled neatly as training for the life these young women were assumed to be heading toward, the running of a refined household of their own, learning to keep a home spotless, to host gracefully, to maintain a showplace under scrutiny, was preparation for the role the culture had in mind for them. The white glove standard wasn't only about the house, it was about the woman the house was shaping, readying her for a future of domestic excellence that everyone simply took for granted. So you scrubbed and dusted and polished, working through your assigned chores in service of a standard that would survive a gloved finger and a watchful eye. You buffed surfaces that already shone, kept the showplace looking like a showplace, and absorbed, whether you meant to or not, the lessons in domestic perfection the whole exercise was designed to teach. The house was beautiful, genuinely beautiful, and keeping it that way was your unpaid second job, performed alongside your studies, your social calendar, and everything else. A spotless house, a spotless reputation, a spotless young woman. In this world, they were all somehow the same project. Let's talk about money, the quiet barrier behind the velvet rope. Membership wasn't free, and it wasn't cheap. There were dues, there were fees, there was the cost of the right clothes for the right occasions, the formals, the gifts, the endless small expenses of keeping up appearances. For many young women, sorority life was simply out of reach, which meant the sisterhood, for all its talk of bonds and belonging, was also a quietly exclusive club shaped by who could afford the entrance. The girls inside rarely discussed it, because discussing money wasn't ladylike either. But the price tag was always there, hovering beneath the surface, gently deciding who got to be a sister and who only got to watch from the outside. Let's start with the obvious costs, the ones written down somewhere. Membership came with dues, regular payments owed to the chapter, plus various fees for initiation and other obligations. Living in the house, where that was the arrangement, carried its own cost. These were real recurring expenses, and they added up, a steady financial commitment that ran the length of your membership. For a young woman from a comfortable family, they were manageable, simply part of the deal. For one from more modest means, they could be a genuine strain or an outright impossibility. The velvet rope had a price, and the price was posted. But the formal dues were only the beginning, because the real expense lived in the appearances. Sorority life demanded a wardrobe, the right clothes for the right occasions, the dresses for the formals, the outfits for rush, the coordinated ensembles that the whole image required. There were the formals themselves, the gifts, the social events, the 1,000 small costs of keeping up with sisters who set a certain standard. Looking the part wasn't free, and the pressure to look the part was constant. A girl could pay her dues and still find herself quietly drowning in the cost of simply keeping up appearances among women who could afford to set the pace. The effect of all this was exclusivity, whether anyone said so or not. The expense meant that sorority life was, in practice, accessible mainly to young women of a certain financial standing. Those whose families could absorb the dues and the wardrobe and the endless extras. The sisterhood spoke beautifully of bonds and belonging and shared womanhood, but the entrance was gated by money, and that gate quietly determined a great deal about who got to belong. It was a club, and clubs have membership fees, and the fees did exactly what fees do. They sorted people into those who could pay and those who could only watch. What made the whole subject especially fraught was the era's discomfort with discussing it. Money was not a ladylike topic. One simply didn't talk about who could afford what. So the financial barrier operated in near silence, never quite named, never openly acknowledged, even as it shaped the entire composition of the house. A young woman struggling to keep up rarely said so. A young woman for whom it all came easily rarely noticed. The price tag hovered beneath everything, powerful precisely because it went unspoken, a barrier maintained by the polite refusal to mention it. So you paid your dues, bought the clothes, covered the costs of the formals and the gifts and the endless small obligations, all without ever quite discussing the toll of it. You kept up appearances among sisters who set a standard your purse could or couldn't easily meet, and you did it quietly, because quiet was the only acceptable way. The sisterhood offered belonging, friendship, a family of sorts, and it offered them in practice to those who could afford the entrance. The bonds were real, so was the bill. And in this world you learned not to mention the second one, even as it shaped who got to share in the first. Now we come to the hardest chapter, and we'll tell it straight. For all the talk of sisterhood and warmth, many sororities of this era maintained rules and practices that deliberately excluded women based on race, religion, and background. Discriminatory clauses, both written and unspoken, kept the doors firmly closed to anyone who didn't fit a narrow ideal. And these barriers persisted well into the era of the civil rights movement and beyond. It's a part of the history that doesn't soften with a joke, so we won't try. The sisterhood that meant so much to those inside was, for far too many young women, a wall they were never permitted to climb. Any honest look at this world has to hold both truths at once, the belonging and the exclusion that made it possible. Let's be plain about what the exclusion actually looked like. Many of the established national organisations of the period carried explicit restrictive clauses in their governing documents, language that limited membership by race or religion, formally barring women who did not fit a narrow definition. Where the rules weren't written down, they were often enforced just as effectively through unspoken understandings, through the selection process, through the quiet ways a community decides who belongs and who does not. The result was the same either way. A great many young women were turned away not for anything they'd done or failed to do, but simply for who they were. This was not a relic of some distant, vanished past. These barriers persisted through the 1950s and into the 1960s, standing firm even as the civil rights movement was challenging segregation and exclusion across American life. While students marched and the country wrestled with its conscience, many of these houses kept their doors closed, their restrictive practices intact, their membership carefully bounded. Change, where it came slowly and often grudgingly, pushed by activists, by changing laws, by students who refused to accept the old arrangements. The exclusion outlived the era's growing awareness that it was wrong, which is part of what makes it so difficult to look at honestly. In response, young women who were shut out built their own. This is the part of the story that deserves real honour. Excluded from the established organisations, women of colour and others kept out by the dominant houses founded and sustained their own sisterhoods, communities rooted in mutual support, service, and pride. These organisations, including the historically black sororities that had been founded decades earlier, offered genuine belonging, lasting bonds, and a powerful legacy of leadership and uplift. The exclusion was real and shameful, but it did not get the final word. Out of the wall, other women built doors of their own. We're telling this one straight because it can't be told any other way. There's no absurd comparison that fits here, no dry punchline that wouldn't feel like a betrayal of the people who are harmed. The cheerful machinery of this whole world, the bells and the formals and the white gloves, ran for many decades alongside a quiet, deliberate practice of keeping certain women out. Both things are true, and an honest account has to carry them together. The warmth that the insiders felt was real. So was the wall that the outsiders faced. Looking back means seeing both at once, without flinching from either. So tonight, as we sit with the long list of rules these young women lived by, we sit also with the hardest rule of all, the line that decided, before anyone said a word, who would even be allowed inside. The sisterhood that gave so much to those it embraced, withheld everything from those it refused, and it did so for far longer than it should have. That's not a comfortable note, and it isn't meant to be. But the women kept out built their own legacies of belonging anyway, fierce and proud and enduring, and that at least is a truth worth carrying gently into the dark. Let's talk about the finished product. The girl all these rules were designed to manufacture. She had a nickname in the popular imagination, something like Susie Sorority, and she was the platonic ideal. Poised, pretty, popular, wholesome, agreeable, and utterly without rough edges. She knew the rules, kept the secrets, made the grades, caught the husband, and never, ever caused a scene. Every weigh-in, every posture lesson, every curfew and inspection and whispered warning was quietly chiselling each young woman toward this single, narrow shape. Individuality was lovely in theory, and faintly suspicious in practice. The goal was a kind of charming uniformity, a house full of bright young women polished until they matched. Some fit the mould happily, others spent 4 years quietly aching to break it. Let's assemble the ideal piece by piece, because every trait was deliberate. She was pretty, of course, groomed to the era's exacting standard, her face and hair and figure all maintained to the expected specifications. She was poised, carrying herself with the trained grace of all those posture lessons. She was popular, socially successful, woven into the right networks and seen at the right events. She was wholesome, her reputation spotless, her virtue beyond question. She was agreeable, pleasant, never difficult, never the source of friction. Each of these qualities had been cultivated, drilled, and rewarded by the entire apparatus of the house. She wasn't born this way, she was built this way. And the building was the whole point of the system, which is the thing worth seeing clearly. Every rule we have explored, the dress codes and the weigh-ins, the charm classes and the curfews, the inspections and the etiquette, and the relentless attention to reputation, all of it pointed toward the same destination, the production of this ideal young woman. The sorority was, among other things, a finishing machine, taking in freshmen and turning out polished, presentable, marriageable ladies who who embodied the values the culture prized. The rules weren't random or arbitrary. They were tools, each one shaping some facet of the finished product. What got sacrificed in the process was individuality, quietly and almost without comment. The goal was a charming uniformity, a house full of young women polished until they matched, and a girl who stood out too sharply, who was too odd, too loud, too different, sat uneasily against that ideal. Conformity was the unspoken expectation, the safe and rewarded path, while genuine individuality was tolerated at best and faintly suspected at worst. You could have a personality, certainly, as long as it fit comfortably within the approved range. Step too far outside it, and you felt the gentle, persistent pressure to come back into line. For the young women living inside this, the experience split many ways. Some fit the mould naturally and happily, finding in it a clear path and a real sense of success. For them, becoming the ideal was a pleasure, not a sacrifice, and there's no reason to begrudge them that. But others felt the squeeze of it, sensed that they were being filed down to fit a shape that wasn't quite their own, and spent their years quietly chafing against expectations they couldn't openly refuse. The same system that fulfilled one girl could slowly stifle the one beside her, and both were sitting at the same dinner table, smiling the same trained smile. So you became her, or you tried to, or you wrestled with her, depending on who you were. You learned the rules and kept the secrets and made the grades and minded your reputation, and somewhere in all of it, the ideal took shape. Poised, pretty, agreeable, polished to a shine. Maybe she fit you like a glove, and maybe she pinched, and maybe you spent 4 years not quite sure which. The house had a vision of the woman it wanted to produce, and it pursued that vision with every rule in the book. Some of you it suited beautifully, some of you it never quite fit, and nearly all of you smiled through it either way because smiling as ever was part of the design. Now, before this all sounds unbearable, let's be fair and talk about the payoff. The formals, the homecomings, the dances that lit up the long, regulated year. After all the rules and the drudgery, there were genuinely magical nights, ball gowns and corsages, mood lighting and live music, a boy in a borrowed jacket and a slow dance under paper decorations. These events were the shimmering reward at the centre of the whole system. The reason the curfews and the charts felt in the moment almost worth it. You planned for weeks, you dressed like royalty, and for a few glittering hours the surveillance softened and the magic took over. It was, for many women, the source of their happiest college memories. The system asked a great deal. Occasionally, it gave something dazzling back. Let's linger on the formal, the crown jewel of the calendar. These were the grand dances, the elegant affairs that the whole year seemed to build toward. Occasions of real glamour in a world that otherwise ran on rules and routine. There were spring formals and winter formals, themed dances, the great social events that gave the membership something to anticipate through the long stretches of study hours and inspections. A formal was special, set apart, a night when the house dressed in its finest and stepped into something that felt, for a few hours, like a fairy tale. The anticipation alone could carry you through weeks of the ordinary. The preparation was half the pleasure. A formal meant weeks of planning, the hunt for the perfect dress, the careful coordination of hair and accessories, the delicious anxiety of whether and by whom you'd be asked. There were corsages to be pinned, dates to be arranged, the whole elaborate ritual of getting ready alongside your sisters in a buzzing, hopeful house. The bathroom that was usually a battlefield became a workshop of transformation. Girls helping girls into their gowns, lending jewellery, offering opinions and reassurance. The shared excitement bound the sisterhood together in one of its happiest forms, the collective thrill of a great night approaching, and then the night itself, which could be genuinely magical. Picture the ballroom or the decorated hall, the live music, the soft lighting, the young women in their gowns and the young men in their jackets, the slow dances and the laughter, and the sense that, for once, you were living something out of the movies. The corsage on your wrist, the boy across from you, the music carrying you across the floor, all of it conspired to create memories that lasted lifetimes. These were the nights women would describe decades later with their eyes lighting up, the shimmering high points of the whole college experience. What made these events matter so much was the contrast with everything around them. After the curfews and the charts, the inspections and the endless rules, the formals were the reward, the shimmering payoff that made the rest feel almost worthwhile. And on those nights, the surveillance itself seemed to soften, the heavy machinery of supervision easing just enough to let the magic in. For a few glittering hours you weren't a girl being monitored and measured. You were a young woman in a beautiful dress, dancing, happy, alive to the moment. The system relaxed its grip just long enough to give you something dazzling, and you took it gladly. So you planned for weeks, dressed like royalty, and stepped into the glittering night the whole long year had been building toward. You danced under the soft lights with a corsage on your wrist, surrounded by your sisters and the boys in their borrowed jackets, and for a few magical hours the rules faded and the magic took over. These were the memories you'd carry forever, the bright spots that made the whole demanding enterprise feel, in retrospect, worth the cost. The system asked a great deal of you, relentlessly and constantly. But every so often, on a night like this, it gave something dazzling back, and you'd remember it for the rest of your life. Eventually graduation comes, and you'd think the rules might finally release their grip. They don't. Leaving the house didn't mean leaving the sisterhood. It meant graduating into the role of alumna, with its own expectations about how you'd carry yourself, marry well, raise a family, and represent the house out in the wider world. You were a sister for life, which sounded beautiful and also meant the watching never entirely stopped. The bonds were real, the friendships often genuine and lifelong, but so was the lingering sense that you remained, always, a reflection of the institution that had shaped you. You walked out the front door for the last time as a student, took one look back at the house that had ruled your every hour, and discovered the rules had simply changed clothes. Let's start with the transition itself, which was framed not as an ending but as a passage. Membership in a sorority was meant to be for life, and graduation didn't sever the tie, it transformed it. You moved from active member to alumna, from a girl living the daily rhythms of the house to a woman carrying its name out into the world. There were ceremonies to mark it, traditions to honour it, a sense that you were stepping across a threshold rather than walking away. The sisterhood you joined as a nervous freshman was now meant to accompany you for the rest of your days, a permanent part of who you were. And with that lifelong status came lifelong expectations, just dressed in new clothes. As an alumna, you were still a representative of the house, still expected to reflect well on it, still carrying its reputation into your adult life. The hope, often stated plainly, was that you'd go on to embody the ideal you'd been shaped toward, marrying well, building a respectable family, conducting yourself with the grace and propriety the sisterhood had instilled. You were a finished product now, released into the world and the house would be watching to see how the product performed. The surveillance didn't end at the front door. It simply followed you out of it. The friendships, though, were the genuine treasure, and they deserve their due. For all the talk of expectations and representation, the bonds forged in that house were often real and deep and lasting. The women you'd lived with, studied with, gotten ready with, survived the rules alongside, became friends for life in a way that was no mere slogan. Decades later, sorority sisters still gathered, still wrote, still stood up at one another's weddings and showed up in one another's hardest moments. Whatever its flaws, the system produced connection, and that connection was, for many women, the thing they valued most about the whole experience. The friendships outlasted everything. But the lingering sense of belonging to the institution never quite faded either, and that was the more complicated inheritance. To be a sister for life meant that you remained always a reflection of the house, that your choices and your conduct carried a meaning beyond yourself, that you'd been shaped by something you couldn't entirely set down. For some women, this was a source of pride and identity, a badge worn happily into old age. For others, it was a quieter thing, a sense of having been formed by a system whose grip persisted long after they had left its walls. The bonds and the obligations came together, inseparable, just as they always had. So you graduated, walked out the front door for the last time as a student, and discovered that leaving wasn't really leaving at all. You became an alumna, a sister for life, carrying the friendships and the expectations together out into your adult years. The house that had ruled your every hour released you into a world where you'd still represent it, still reflect it, still belong to it. You took one last look back at the place that had shaped you, at the windows and the parlour and the porch where you'd slept in the cold, and you understood the final lesson of the sisterhood. The rules didn't end at graduation. They just changed clothes and followed you home. So here you are at the end of it, having lived through the bell and the house mother, the weigh-ins and the white gloves, the curfews and the secret songs and the endless gentle pressure to become someone slightly smaller than you actually were. And the strangest part is this. Many of these women look back not with bitterness, but with deep affection. Beneath the absurd rules and the very real cruelties, they found friendship, structure, belonging, and a place that felt, for a few short years, like home. The sisterhood was a contradiction, a cage and a comfort all at once, a system that policed young women while also sometimes holding them up. It demanded conformity, and somehow forged loyalty that lasted lifetimes. History rarely fits into a tidy box, and neither, it turns out, did they. Let's gather up the contradiction, because it sits at the very centre of this story. Everything we've explored has pulled in two directions at once. The same house that weighed a girl's body also wiped her tears. The same sisters who sat in judgment on the standards board also lent her their best dresses and stood up at her wedding. The same system that filed young women down toward a narrow ideal also gave them confidence, structure, friendship, and a fierce sense of belonging. These weren't separate experiences happening to separate people. They were the same experience, tangled together, lived by the same young women in the same houses at the same time. The cage and the comfort were one structure. Consider what the sisterhood genuinely gave, because it was real and it mattered. In a frightening transitional time of life, far from home and uncertain of the future, these young women found a ready-made family, a place to belong, a set of friends who became lifelong. They found structure when they might have floundered, support when they struggled, and a community that, for all its rules, looked after its own. The bonds forged in those years lasted decades, carrying women through marriages and careers and losses and triumphs. Whatever else it was, the sisterhood was, for countless women, the source of their deepest and most enduring friendships. That gift was not nothing. It was for many everything. But we won't pretend the cost away, because honesty matters more than nostalgia. The rules really did police these women, body and behaviour, reputation and movement, in ways that range from the absurd to the genuinely harmful. The system shaped them toward conformity, measured their worth against narrow standards, and, as we've seen, kept some women out entirely on the basis of who they were. The warmth was real, and so was the constraint. To remember this world honestly is to hold the affection and the critique together, to honour the belonging without excusing the harm, to laugh at the absurdity without forgetting the women who were hurt by it. And perhaps that's the truest thing we can say about it all, that it refuses to resolve into a simple verdict. The young women who lived inside these rules weren't fools or victims or anything so flat. They were complicated people navigating a complicated world with the tools and the options they were given. Many look back with real fondness, and that fondness is legitimate. Many also recognise now the weight of what was asked of them, and that recognition is legitimate too. Both can be true. Both are true. The sisterhood was a contradiction, and the women who lived it were big enough to contain the contradiction whole. So we'll leave them here, these resilient, polished, complicated young women of a vanished era, with their bells and their white gloves and their secret songs. They followed 1,000 rules, kept 100 secrets, and forged friendships that outlasted nearly everything else about their lives. They were policed, and they were held, constrained and connected, filed down and lifted up, often all at once. History, as ever, refuses to fit in a tidy box, and neither, it turns out, did they, those stubborn, smiling young women who lived by the rules and somehow, quietly, became themselves anyway. So how was your day in the sisterhood? You woke to a bell you couldn't argue with, painted on a face before you were allowed to be seen, and laced yourself into a girdle, a dress code, and a smile you weren't permitted to drop. You were weighed and measured, inspected and chaperoned, signed in and signed out like a parcel with a curfew. You guarded your reputation like treasure, kept secrets you swore never to tell, and raced home across a cold lawn to beat a deadline the boys across the street never once had to think about. It was relentless, and it was often absurd, and underneath all of it were real young women simply doing their best to belong in a world that watched their every move. They found friendship in crowded bathrooms and comfort in a stern house mother's care. They danced under soft lights in beautiful gowns and laughed in the dark with sisters who would last a lifetime. They were policed and they were held, all at once, and somehow they carried it with grace, with humour, and with a stubborn, smiling resilience that's worth honouring tonight. So as you settle into your own bed, in your own room, with the door closed if you like and no one keeping a ledger of your comings and goings, take a quiet moment to be grateful. Grateful for privacy. Grateful for the freedom to be exactly as you are, unpolished and unmeasured and entirely your own. Grateful that the only bell tonight is the one you choose to set, because history isn't only grand and terrible. Sometimes it's white gloves and weigh-ins and 3 feet on the floor, proof that people are resilient, ridiculous, and a great deal kinder to themselves now than they used to be. Sleep well. You've earned the quiet.